A racist cop tased a black veteran's son outside his mother's funeral. Thought the story would end there. But 7 minutes later, Big Shaq stepped out of a black SUV, not to mourn, but to dismantle everything that badge thought it could hide. The funeral sparked it. Shaq finished it, and Lindell Creek was never the same again. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun bore down hard on the red clay of southern Georgia, baking the silence into something heavy. Outside the modest white chapel, nestled between crooked oak trees, a small crowd stood stiff in black. The American flag hung at half-mast, windlit. A few scattered chairs bore the weight of older men in worn suits, some with medals pinned proudly to their lapels, others just bearing scars no one could see. In the front row, a teenage girl clutched the flag from her father's coffin, so tightly it looked like it might tear. He had been a soldier, a black veteran who wore his uniform longer than he had a safe home. His name was Jasper Marin. Fought in Iraq, came home, built engines, raised his daughter alone after her mother passed, never missed church, never raised his voice. And yet, when he died, barely a headline whispered his name. Today, the community gathered to do what the government never did: honor him. Behind the chapel, past the aging cemetery fence, lay the old sections of town, the ones people didn't name on tourist maps, places where sidewalks ended and bias began. The town of Lindell Creek was no stranger to good intentions, buried under bad systems. People knew where to walk, where to talk, and where not to be caught after dark. And yet here in broad daylight, a new kind of shadow slid across the crowd. The buzz of a police cruiser crept into the air like static. A white Dodge Charger, fresh paint, dark-tinted windows. It coasted slow past the chapel entrance, then parked half on the sidewalk, engine idling. The driver didn't exit right away. Inside, Officer Wade Trenton watched the mourners like a man watching for movement that didn't fit, like he was hunting guilt instead of offering protection. Nobody said anything. They just noticed. Trenton was known, not for heroics, not for kindness, for something else entirely, the kind of badge that weighed more than it served. The crowd shifted uneasily, conversations thinning into silence. A pastor's voice cracked as he delivered the final prayer. From her folding chair, Layla Marin, the soldier's daughter, stared at the cruiser with a mixture of fear and fury. She was 15, her hair braided tight, her fingers trembling beneath the cloth of folded stars and stripes. She didn't need a sermon about injustice. She lived it every time she passed the corner store her father was once thrown out of for looking out of place in his own neighborhood. The service was brief, deliberately quiet. There were no cameras, no speeches from city officials, only the sharp fold of the flag, the salute of two aging veterans, and the dull sound of dirt beginning its descent onto the casket below. As people began to walk toward their cars, Officer Trenton finally stepped out. He wasn't in a rush. Sunglasses on, belt heavy with gear, his gaze landed on the tall young man helping Layla to her feet. Elijah, the son of Jasper's wartime friend, broad-shouldered, clean-cut, still in partial uniform, a man who looked like he could be trouble, if trouble was defined by posture and skin. Trenton didn't speak. He just watched. Slowly approached. No one heard what he said. Not then. But the way Elijah stood straighter, the way his jaw clenched, said enough. Something wasn't right. Something ancient was happening again, right there on a Sunday afternoon. From the edge of the lot, a black SUV pulled in slowly, bigger than the rest. The tires crunched against gravel like thunder, trying not to wake the dead. The door opened, and out stepped Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq. Not dressed to impress, but not invisible either. He was late, but he was there, wearing the grief of a man who'd known too many funerals like this one. He didn't speak, not yet, just looked. Took in the cruiser, the cop, the fear, and the daughter holding that folded flag like it was all she had left. The wind picked up, finally. The flag moved. So did the story. The silence before the storm had ended. As the last handful of earth struck the coffin with a low, hollow thud, the funeral began to break apart in slow, grieving ripples. People murmured half-sentences, some just nodding at one another, eyes swollen, voices buried deep. The sky had begun to cloud over slightly, the sun filtered now by soft grays that turned the churchyard even more solemn. Elijah stood near the open grave, head bowed, one hand clenched, the other still resting gently on Layla's shoulder. He hadn't said a word since the fold of the flag. Officer Trenton, meanwhile, hadn't moved far from his cruiser. He leaned against it now, arms crossed, scanning the mourners, like a man inspecting stolen goods. A couple of older attendees noticed, squinting with quiet concern, but did nothing. The presence of the badge, his badge, was a barrier no one dared cross. Not here, not in Lindell Creek. And then Trenton started walking. Each step was deliberate, boots tapping against the pavement with the rhythm of authority, mistaken for righteousness. He didn't aim for the crowd. He didn't even glance at the pastor, who was still offering words of comfort to the widow of a man buried too young. He headed straight for Elijah. The young man looked up just as Trenton came into earshot. The officer's face bore a kind of grin that wasn't exactly a smile, more like the residue of someone who had power and knew it. Elijah's back straightened, but he didn't move, didn't retreat. His eyes locked onto Trenton's, not with aggression but with a kind of exhausted defiance. It was the stare of someone who had stood up before and knew it wouldn't save him. "Got ID?" Trenton asked, low and too calm for the moment. Elijah frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "I'm at a funeral." Trenton didn't blink. That wasn't the question. People nearby started turning. Not fast, not in panic, but with the gradual curiosity of those who sensed something wrong. One woman whispered to her husband. Another reached for her phone. The pastor paused mid-sentence. Layla moved behind Elijah's arm, shrinking slightly from the tension thickening in the air. "I'm not doing this with you right now," Elijah replied, voice firm, breath catching in his throat. Trenton stepped closer. "You raised your voice. That's disorderly conduct." "No," Elijah said quietly. "You came here looking for a reason." And then it happened. There was no wind-up, no loud threat, no gun drawn, just the dry click of a trigger and the sudden electrical snap of a taser discharge. Elijah's body seized, buckled, and collapsed onto the fresh earth where his father had just been buried. The folded flag in Lila's arms dropped to the ground beside him. Screams tore through the crowd. A man cursed aloud. Another woman shrieked. Someone pulled out their phone, finally, filming with trembling hands. The pastor lunged forward, but stopped himself mid-step, hands raised uselessly. Trenton holstered his device, looking down at Elijah like he'd swatted a fly. And through the chaos, the black SUV rolled to a halt. Shaquille O'Neal stepped out just as the scene unfolded. He didn't rush. He didn't speak, but his eyes, dark and wide and filled with disbelief, saw everything in a single breath. The collapsed young man, the weeping girl trying to gather the flag, the crowd too stunned to move, and the officer walking away as if nothing had happened. Shaq moved forward, not toward Trenton, but toward Elijah. The mourners parted, for him without being asked, the same way water gives way to stone. He kneeled beside the fallen man, one massive hand on his back, checking his breathing, eyes never leaving his face. Elijah groaned faintly. He was alive, conscious, but shaken, disoriented, not from the pain, but from the sheer cruelty of it all. Shaq looked up. The SUV's engine clicked as it cooled. Trenton had paused near the chapel steps, aware now of the shift in mood, but unwilling to retreat. His authority hung thin in the air, like a curtain someone was about to pull down. The crowd had begun to turn, but not with panic, with something colder. Disgust, anger that trembled in the throat and tightened fists, but stayed just barely behind civility. People knew this town. They knew Trenton. And now they had no one had expected him to show. Not here. Not today. But Shaquille had kept tabs on Jasper for years. Quiet donations, letters of support, a basketball signed and delivered to Layla on her 10th birthday. He didn't need to be family to understand the weight of what had just happened. He stood slowly, towering over the gathered mourners, but saying nothing. He didn't have to. The look on his face said enough. Grief, fury, and something deeper, resolve. The funeral had ended, but the reckoning had only just begun. The church lot had frozen under a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, the kind of silence that followed injustice so blatant, it stunned people past words. And through that silence came movement, deliberate, measured. The door of the black SUV closed with a soft but heavy thud, and from it emerged a man who once owned the roar of arenas, but now moved like a quiet force of reckoning. Shaquille O'Neal. Big Shaq was no stranger to loss. He had buried teammates, friends, even strangers he later came to know through stories. Just like this. But standing here on this Georgia clay, his frame casting a long shadow across the cemetery pavement. This wasn't just about grief. This was about pattern, about repetition, about watching once again, as a black life was reduced to suspicion and silence by the same kind of edge that promised to protect it. He walked slowly, every step echoing louder than Trenton's command had moments earlier. People shifted as he passed. Some nodded, others just stared, as if seeing not the celebrity but the man. The weight behind the smile, the steel behind the softness. Layla knelt beside Elijah, her fingers clumsily trying to straighten the folded flag, her other hand trembling as it hovered above her friend's chest. Elijah was breathing, but shallowly. His fingers twitched against the gravel, his body still tense with the aftershock. His eyes fluttered open briefly, enough to register movement, enough to see the familiar towering shape moving toward him, not with panic but with purpose. Shaq didn't speak. He crouched beside Elijah, placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, and looked him in the eye. That single look was enough. It said, "I saw. I'm here. You're not alone." Elijah exhaled, slow and broken. Trenton, standing now a few paces away, adjusted his sunglasses with forced indifference. He didn't call for backup, didn't reach for his radio, but the tension in his stance betrayed something, nervous calculation. He hadn't expected an audience of this magnitude, especially not this man, not today. Shaq turned his head slightly, scanning the faces around him. The pastor, the mourners, the veterans who had stood silently through a funeral now ruined by a uniform disruption. His gaze finally settled on Trenton, but still he said nothing. No confrontation, no accusation, just that unreadable expression, part disappointment, part warning. The crowd's mood began to shift. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was mutating into something else, righteousness. Shaq didn't need to rally them. His presence alone re-centered the moment. What had been a sudden chaotic abuse of power was now under scrutiny, and no one, especially Trenton, could ignore the eyes that had turned on him. Shaq rose from his crouch, towering even more, as he stood fully upright. He didn't advance toward the officer. He didn't need to. Every foot between them already spoke volume. The tension hung thick in the air, not violent, but volatile. An invisible line had been drawn, not in anger, but in truth. He turned to Layla, gently helping her to her feet, retrieving the dropped flag and brushing the dust from its corners before handing it back to her. Her fingers clutched it again, not quite steady, but firmer now. Her gaze held his for a beat, tear-filled and grateful. From the sidelines, one of the funeral attendees, a middle-aged woman named Rochelle, stepped forward, phone still in hand. Her video had captured everything: the taser, Elijah's fall, the expressions on the faces around them, and Shaq stepping into the aftermath like a silent wave of resistance. She didn't say a word either. Just nodded toward him and stepped back into the line. By now others were raising their phones, not in hysteria, not for spectacle, but for documentation. The community had learned its lesson. Silence had never saved them. But today, something had changed. They were no longer voiceless. And this time, someone with weight, real weight, was on their side. Trenton shifted again. His hands now rested on his belt, not quite comfortable. His authority, once so casually wielded, now felt like a brittle uniform. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. The moment didn't belong to him anymore. Shaq finally walked away, not with haste, but with finality. He moved toward the chapel steps where the pastor stood waiting, hands folded. As they exchanged a brief look, the Reverend lowered his head, humble. Shaq didn't need a platform. He didn't ask for headlines. His purpose wasn't grandstanding. It was bearing witness, and being the kind of presence no injustice could ignore. And in that his silence had done more than any shouted protest could have mustered. This wasn't the end of it. Not for Trenton, not for Elijah, and not for the town that thought the world wasn't watching. Because now it was. 7 minutes. That's all it took for the world to shift. From the instant Officer Wade Trenton's finger squeezed the taser's trigger, to the moment Shaquille O'Neal stood directly in front of him. 7 minutes passed. Not fast. Not slow. Just long enough to feel the stretch of history folding in on itself. Shaq hadn't said a word in all that time. He had tended to Elijah, helped Layla recover her breath, and observed the scene with the quiet control of someone used to navigating fire without becoming part of the flame. But during those same minutes, something deeper unfolded, something that wouldn't make the newsreel, but lived in the heartbeat of the town's memory. While the mourners gathered their composure and the phones kept rolling, the story beneath the surface began to uncoil. Officer Trenton's name wasn't unfamiliar in Lindell Creek. He'd been wearing that badge for 6 years, but his shadow stretched longer than his service. Before the uniform, before the title, he was just Wade, son of the former police chief, born into a legacy wrapped, not in honor but in unchecked power. His father, Martin Trenton, had once ruled the department like a fiefdom. Files went missing, reports were rewritten, and when a young black man named Curtis Marin was found bloodied in a back alley in 1992, the only person who ever faced charges was the friend who tried to help him to the hospital. Curtis survived, barely, but he never walked the same again. That man was Elijah's father. The dots weren't hard to connect for those who dared to look, but in Lindell Creek, looking too closely had consequences. So people stopped asking questions, stopped remembering, until now. As Shaq slowly rose to his full height, his eyes locked onto Trenton's, with a calm that was far more dangerous than rage. The kind of calm that signaled nothing was being overlooked. Not the taser, not the silence, not the badge that gleamed like a smirk under the daylight. And in that exact moment, across town, a quiet phone line buzzed to life. From the back office of a community legal center, a volunteer named Nadine, 63, sharp as glass, was already pulling records. Shaq had texted her the name. Just one. Trenton. She knew what to do. She'd been gathering files for years, waiting for the day when someone with a spine strong enough would ask for them. 7 minutes. Enough time for Nadine to email a zip folder, labeled LCPD, Internal Misconduct Archive, Trenton line. Enough time for a server in Atlanta to ping an alert to a civilian oversight committee. Enough time for 3 separate camera angles of the incident to upload to a cloud drive, and for Rochelle's video to cross the invisible border between community tragedy and national outrage. Trenton didn't know yet, didn't sense how much ground was already moving beneath his feet. He still stood as though this was just another afternoon, another misunderstood black man, another report to tweet. But the energy around him had changed. Shaq took a step forward, not aggressive, just deliberate. Each motion weighed with a sense of inevitability. His presence wasn't just physical, it was judicial, not legal, not official, but moral. His voice had not yet been heard, but it didn't need to be, not when everything else was already speaking. Behind Shaq, the pastor shifted uneasily. He was old enough to remember the summer of '88, when Trenton's father had raided a community barbecue claiming it was a gang gathering. He remembered the screaming, the headlines that never printed. He remembered Curtis too. The threads were no longer tangled. They were being pulled tight. Shaq paused just a few feet from Trenton, standing with arms at his side, not crossed, not defensive, just ready. "You got something to say, sir?" Trenton asked, finally breaking the stillness. His voice tried to sound official, but it cracked faintly at the end. Shaq didn't answer. He just kept looking. His silence had become a mirror, and Trenton didn't like what he saw reflected back. 7 minutes. Long enough for truths to resurface, for scars to reopen, for a town's suppressed history to exhale. All at once. Elijah stirred on the ground behind them. Paramedics were arriving now, wheels clattering against concrete. Layla stood close, her eyes locked not on the EMTs, but on the face of the man who'd stood for her when no one else had. Shaq finally shifted his gaze away from Trenton. He turned, slow and steady, and began walking back toward Elijah. He placed one large hand on the young man's shoulder again, and looked up at the pastor. A small nod passed between them. He didn't need to confront Trenton. That part was done. The confrontation now moved elsewhere, into files, into footage, into names whispered back, into relevance, into the hands of those ready to make sure this day didn't vanish like so many others. 7 minutes. That's all it took for injustice to make its usual appearance. But this time it didn't leave with the last shovel of dirt. This time, it stayed. Lindell Creek never made the front pages, not even when it should have. It wasn't the kind of place people marked on road trips or documentaries. It existed between exit signs and forgotten exits. A town that grew from cotton and kept its rules buried under civility and concrete. The sidewalks were narrow, but the lines, unseen but firm, ran deeper than any street map. You could live here your whole life and still never be welcome in every part of it. The incident at the chapel hadn't yet reached national screens. There were no news vans parked beside the white fence, no anchors rehearsing outrage into microphones. But something more potent had started to stir, something invisible, yet undeniable, the local memory, the kind of memory that didn't need to be televised to be powerful, the kind that lived in whispers, in records too old to digitize, and in the eyes of people who'd stopped trusting apologies a long time ago. Shaquille O'Neal's presence had already shifted the day, but what it was now beginning to shift was the story. He hadn't said much, hadn't needed to, but word spread faster than broadcast. Shaq was in town, and he saw everything. And more importantly, he wasn't leaving. The town's past wasn't something most people spoke of, especially not with new neighbors. The high school trophy case didn't display the years when black athletes weren't allowed on the roster. The police station's walls didn't mention the years of unfiled complaints, and certainly no one handed out brochures explaining how Lindell Creek's oldest neighborhoods were deliberately sliced apart in the 1950s when the highway system accidentally carved through 3 black-owned blocks. But the scars remained, tucked beneath repaved roads, buried under the community center that used to be a jailhouse, forgotten in documents yellowing in a courthouse attic, and no matter how many times new mayors promised unity, the ghosts of the town's original architecture haunted the present. Take the cemetery behind the chapel, for instance. Most thought it was just old weather-worn stones and crooked markers, but what most didn't know was that half of those graves were unmarked. Not from time, but from refusal. For decades, black veterans were buried without service plaques, their names omitted from records because they didn't fit the criteria of honor. Jasper Marin's father had served in World War II, but his plot lay nameless, just a corner of ground where the grass grew taller out of neglect. Inside the city records building, locked behind a forgotten clerk's desk, was a complaint file with 47 entries, every one tied to the Trenton family. Not just Wade, his father, his uncle, a cousin briefly deputized in 2003. The same patterns, same tactics, uncooperative suspects resisting questioning, miscommunication during detainment. Most were dismissed for insufficient evidence, and more than half involved the same side of town, West Lindell, the side redlined in 1962, and still battling for clean water pressure. People in town weren't blind, they were just tired. Tired of pushing rocks uphill, while officials labeled gravity procedural error. Tired of funerals doubling as protests. Of watching their sons survive combat abroad, only to be treated like threats at home. And now, for the first time in years, someone with weight stood on their side, and not from a podium, but from the ground, eye level with the pain. Shaq hadn't just shown up. He'd been watching this town for a while, quietly funding community clinics, helping rebuild the basketball court that had once been burned down during a so-called equipment fire. He'd sent checks anonymously to a local mother's fund after a wrongful eviction, and every time he'd been in the area, he'd kept tabs not on headlines, but on the silences that followed them. But this time, there was no retreat. His SUV stayed parked. His phone stayed in hand. He walked through town later that day, down past the diner where signs still lingered in the undertones of family values, past the courthouse where Jasper Marin once sat 3 hours for a parking ticket hearing that ended in nothing. Wherever he went, people looked. Not all with welcome, some with resentment, knowing the status quo was being disturbed, but others with quiet awe, a recognition that perhaps, finally, the weight of what had always been ignored was now undeniable. In one of the back corners of the old town library, a librarian named Jerome opened a drawer that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were news clippings from decades ago, folded, brittle, smudged from time. The 1992 alley beating, the 1988 youth altercation that involved tear gas, and a photo almost faded beyond repair of Curtis Marin in uniform smiling beside his son. Jerome scanned the photo and emailed it, not to a journalist but to a community watchdog list. He captioned it simply, "They've always been worth remembering." Outside the chapel, Shaq sat alone for a while on the edge of the cemetery bench. He didn't take calls. He didn't record anything. Just stared out at the fields where the shadows fell long and the truths even longer. He knew what was coming. The story had found its shape now. It had roots, and roots, once disturbed, do not settle quietly. Lindell Creek had swallowed truth for years, but this time, it was choking on it. Shaq sat in the stillness of the rental chapel's garden, a quiet space carved out behind the rows of gravestones. The sky had started to burn a faint gold, not quite sunset, but enough to cast long shadows across the bricks. His phone, face down on the bench beside him, vibrated softly, a rhythm that didn't beg for attention, but reminded him the clock hadn't stopped ticking. The town was shifting behind him, a quiet storm building, whispers turning into stories, and stories into pressure. Trenton had returned to his cruiser, but hadn't left. He stayed parked by the sidewalk, like a man holding onto power with fingernails. He hadn't spoken again, but his presence was more of a statement than words could manage. He still thought he was untouchable. Shaq finally picked up the phone. He didn't check social media, didn't draft a statement or dial up a celebrity contact for noise. He went to his contacts and found a name buried under layers of others. One that rarely showed up in the news, but had more power than a headline ever could. Inez Calhoun, Senior Counsel, Governor's Advisory Board on Police Conduct. A name known behind mahogany doors, not microphones. He hit the green call button. It rang twice. Shaquille? The voice on the other end was sharp, familiar, not warm, but not cold, professional with history. Inez, he said calmly. We've got a problem in Lindell Creek. She didn't ask what kind. She knew if he was calling. It wasn't for gossip. I'm listening, she replied. In a few clear sentences, Shaq explained. The taser, the location, the officer, the prior complaints. No embellishment, no dramatic language. Just facts, delivered in a tone that turned those facts into charges heavier than court filings. Inez listened, typed, and at one point whispered something to someone else in the room with her. Then, with practiced precision, she asked for a name. Wade Trenton, Shaq said. Son of Martin Trenton. There was a pause long enough to register understanding. Then a slow breath from her end. That name's been floating around oversight files for a while, she said quietly. Never enough to act. Until now. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence between them was a handshake, one built not on favor but shared intent. You'll have my report in 24 hours, Inez said. I'll activate the audit. We'll see how far this goes. Shaq ended the call with a low thank you, then let the phone drop back to the bench. That one call wasn't a bluff. It wasn't about optics. It was the culmination of years of groundwork most people didn't know he'd been laying. While his public image stayed focused on philanthropy, sports and lighthearted charm, Shaq had spent his post-career years networking with justice reform advocates, city attorneys, even former federal prosecutors disillusioned by the machinery they once served. What the world didn't see were the community task force meetings he sat in, without press, the bailouts he funded quietly, the policy drafts he reviewed late at night with civil rights lawyers looking for someone to back their proposals when no one else would. This moment wasn't just reactive. It was prepared for. Trenton's file wasn't just problematic. It was a blueprint of unchecked authority. And now it was in the hands of someone who had the state's ear and a reason to use it. Inside the chapel, the mood had shifted again. Mourners were now sitting in quiet clusters, talking in hushed voices, watching as Elijah, conscious now, was loaded gently into an ambulance. The taser's sting had left no broken bones, but the trauma etched itself deeper. Layla held her father's folded flag in her lap like a shield against something too large to name. Trenton stood on the sidewalk, talking into his own radio now, posture stiff. He had noticed Shaq's call, maybe not the content, but the timing, and he felt it, the slipping of the ground under his boots. Shaq walked back through the chapel gates, slowly. No announcement, no rally cry, just a man with purpose. Behind the scenes, the wheels had started to turn. Trenton didn't know it yet, but his career wasn't just in jeopardy, it was unraveling. And not just his. Others tied to the system that kept him insulated were now blinking under the sudden unwanted light. This wasn't going to be a courtroom drama. It would be a procedural demolition. And it had started with one name, one voice, and one call. By early evening, the weight of what happened had begun to move through town like heat through iron. Slow, steady, irreversible. The ambulance carrying Elijah had pulled away, destination confidential. Layla rode beside him, silent, flag still clutched. The chapel slowly emptied, but Shaq remained in Lindell Creek, posted not as a guest anymore, but as something more enduring. A witness who wouldn't blink. In a quiet corner of the city records annex, Inez Calhoun's team had begun reviewing the data dump. Shaq's tip had triggered. Most of the files were known. Redacted disciplinary actions. Complaint summaries labeled inconclusive. Nothing that, on paper, screamed corruption. But buried deeper, in a box marked historical admin, was something that hadn't been touched in over 2 decades. A sealed internal affairs log from 1992. It was tagged with a name, Chief Martin Trenton. The same year Curtis Marin, Elijah's father, had been found near the old textile mill, unconscious and bloodied, officially ruled a bar brawl. Unofficially, a racially motivated assault that never made it past a single paragraph in the local paper. Charges were filed against a young black man from another county, but those charges had mysteriously vanished by spring, and the one person who'd fought hardest to open an inquiry into what really happened was Curtis himself.
Curtis, the man buried just hours earlier.
That same year, a then young officer Wade Trenton had joined the police academy, ushered in by a father who ran the department like a fortress. His badge wasn't earned. It was handed down, part of a legacy that was never about justice, but about dominance. And now, all these years later, Elijah stood on the other side of that same legacy, tased outside his own father's funeral by the son of the man who had once buried his family's truth. It wasn't coincidence. It was vengeance. The realization hit like a cold wind sweeping through the town's history. Elijah wasn't just profiled. He was targeted. This wasn't just a cop out of line. It was a vendetta wrapped in decades of institutional immunity. Shaq stood by the courthouse steps as the first pieces of the report began to circulate. He held no papers, but his phone buzzed in his hand. Inez's voice firm and clipped in a text. "It's bigger than expected. Patterns are forming. Prepare for escalation." He already had. Shaq had suspected there was more to Trenton than arrogance. He'd seen too many of these types over the years. Second-generation cops raised on code words and backyard stories about when the town was clean. But this was deeper, personal, and now provable. From the clerk's desk at the county archive, a woman named Desiree, who had worked in silence for years, finally spoke. She sent copies of the 1992 file to Inez's office, along with a note typed in caps. He covered it up. We all knew. Her email wasn't anonymous. She was done hiding. Back on Main Street, the mood shifted. No sirens, no shouting, but the energy cracked like thunder without rain. Local business owners who once said nothing now whispered behind registers. School teachers who knew both the Marin family and the Trenton name began to quietly connect dots. This wasn't just a funeral gone wrong anymore. It was exposure. Shaq walked the sidewalk past the old diner again. Inside, the same white-haired man who had looked up earlier now lowered his gaze. Across the street, a group of teens stood around their bikes, watching him not with awe, but recognition. They understood something was happening, and for once they weren't the ones being pushed to the margins. Trenton still hadn't left town. His cruiser was now parked by the municipal building, where he'd retreated under the guise of filing incident reports. But inside he was pacing. He felt it, knew it. The shift, the unraveling. His father's name was starting to surface in private forums. Retired officers were being contacted. Records once buried were now digitized. And Shaq, he was still here, still watching, still making calls. Not for drama, but for documentation. And the final piece clicked into place. At a storage facility just outside of town, a security box rented to Jasper Marin contained a journal, his own father's, a detailed account of the attack in 1992, complete with a name Curtis had never dared utter aloud. Blaine Trenton, Wade's cousin, a badge carrier at the time, listed in the report as present, but never questioned. The journal had been unread by anyone but Jasper. Until now, it would be scanned, submitted, and it would pull the final curtain. As dusk settled over Lindell Creek, the town's secret stopped being a secret. The quiet war that had raged beneath its surface had finally reached daylight. And in that daylight stood a man who had seen it coming. Shaq hadn't just shown up for a funeral. He had arrived to finish something someone else never got the chance to. Night had crept over Lindell Creek, with a slow, heavy crawl. The street lamps buzzed to life, casting pale halos across cracked sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. The town felt quieter than usual, not because fewer people were talking, but because too many were finally listening. Shaq sat inside the small guest room, at the back of the chapel. the only light coming from a desk lamp humming faintly overhead. His shoulders were hunched, his hands clasped in front of him, as if bracing for something he already suspected. On the table lay an envelope. It was old, faded around the edges, the handwriting on the front elegant, but trembling. It had been handed to him by the pastor only an hour earlier. Passed from Jasper's belongings, it bore his late wife's name, Lenora Marin, and one line across the front in blue ink. For Shaquille. When the time is right. Now was the time. He opened it slowly, the paper inside soft with age, but firm in tone. Her handwriting told the story, even before the words did. A woman who had lived in silence for too long. A woman who had carried too much. Shaquille, if you're reading this, it means Jasper is gone. I know you'll be there. You were always more than a name to him. You were his lighthouse when the world went dark. Shaq's eyes didn't move fast. Each word landed with weight. There are things I was never allowed to say out loud. After Curtis came back from the Gulf, he wasn't just broken physically. He was hunted, not in alleys, in boardrooms, on paper, the benefits they denied him, the housing applications they lost, the job interviews that ended the moment he walked in. They called it post-war adjustment. It was punishment, for surviving, for being too proud. Lenora's letter detailed it all. Quiet systemic sabotage, dressed up as bureaucracy, a discharge rating, altered after an anonymous review, a local contractor pulling a job offer, after a call from the sheriff's office, threats that came not from shadows but from official letterheads. Jasper kept receipts, files, but he never went public, not after what they did to Curtis. He always said, "Don't stir water that's already poisoned." He meant well, but silence didn't save us. It buried us. Shaq's hands tightened slightly. He remembered her. Strong voice, soft eyes, always stood behind Jasper like armor. And now, years later, she was handing him the blade he never knew she'd kept hidden. The letter shifted tone near the bottom, grew more personal, confessional. They came to the house once, not officers, men in plain clothes, said they heard Jasper was asking too many questions. They didn't shout, just smiled. One of them touched Elijah's head and said, "Let sleeping dogs lie. I never forgot that, never. I'm not asking you to fight our battles. Just finish what we couldn't. You have reached Shaquille. But more than that, you still believe truth can move walls. If you're reading this, move them." She signed it simply, Lenora. Shaq stared at the final line for a long moment, his breath slow, eyes moist. The letter had no dates, no grand accusations, just names, events, enough breadcrumbs to trace the full arc of quiet oppression that had stalked her family for decades. It was personal, raw, but also tactical, a letter that didn't just speak to grief. It was a roadmap for accountability. He folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket, not to be hidden, but to be carried. Outside the chapel, the atmosphere had transformed. The whispers had evolved into quiet calls for action. A few local reporters had caught wind, not from national headlines, but from community posts gaining unusual traction. No sirens, no press conferences, but eyes were starting to turn toward Lindell Creek. And with this letter, Shaq now held not just witness testimony, but generational truth, etched in a widow's last words. He stepped out of the chapel into the cool night air, the weight of the letter against his chest, like armor made of paper. He didn't look around for cameras. There were none. But he knew the ripple had already begun. The story wasn't just about a taser or a funeral. It was about a family pushed to the edge, warned into silence, and now finally speaking through a daughter's trembling hands, a son's stunned breath, and a mother's inked truth. The political had just become personal, and the personal had just become undeniable. It started with a shaky hand and a cracked phone screen. Nothing rehearsed, nothing planned. Rochelle Bennett, a retired school counselor with arthritis in her knuckles and a quiet resolve in her soul, had been standing near the edge of the chapel garden when she raised her phone and hit record. Not to go viral, not for proof, just instinct. Something in her spirit told her, this can't go unseen. By nightfall, that decision had become the pivot point. The footage was grainy at first, a little off angle, but it captured everything. The moment Officer Trenton confronted Elijah, the exact second the taser sparked, and the haunting collapse that followed. It didn't stop there. Rochelle had kept recording, too stunned to look away, as Shaq stepped from his SUV and walked into frame like a silent storm front. She hadn't posted it immediately. She was old school. She showed it to her niece first, Dara, a college sophomore with a gift for social media and a deep mistrust of silence. Within minutes, Dara uploaded it under a single caption: "This is what mourning while black looks like in Lindell Creek." The internet didn't blink. By the time dawn approached, the video had crossed platforms, aggregated into compilations, reshared by activists, lawyers, and celebrities alike. It wasn't just the taser, it was the sequence. Elijah, standing tall in a clean-cut Navy uniform, head bowed in grief. Layla beside him, cradling a folded flag. The crowd respectful, quiet. And then, the disruption, Trenton's sudden approach, his unnecessary escalation, and the mechanical hiss of the taser that knocked Elijah to the ground beside his father's fresh grave. The final 20 seconds of the clip sealed its impact. Shaq's approach, silent, unshaken, eyes burning not with fury but with knowing, held the nation. No words, no threats, just presence. A presence that rewrote the scene entirely. The narrative online wasn't just outrage, it was heartbreak. The hashtags came quick, but so did the questions. Who was Elijah? Why was a decorated veteran treated like a threat at a funeral? And why was the only response from law enforcement a taser?
Within 12 hours, major networks had contacted Rochelle. She declined interviews, but Dara gave permission for syndication. Local news stations camped outside the city hall before the mayor even knew what hit her. And by midday, Lindell Creek, a town long adept at burying its sins, found itself under national scrutiny. Trenton, unaware at first, had reported to the station early, hoping to preempt backlash with paperwork. But the internet moved faster than any report. Screens around him buzzed with headlines. Georgia cop tases mourning black veteran at funeral, and Shaquille O'Neal witnesses racial profiling in Lindell Creek. His world shrank quickly. Internal Affairs called before he could brief his captain. By afternoon, his locker access was revoked, pending inquiry. But the worst blow wasn't procedural, it was reputational. His face, once anonymous beyond the badge, now filled the feeds of people demanding consequences. Meanwhile, the community didn't wait for instructions. Posters of Elijah, in uniform, began appearing on poles and storefronts, with the phrase, "He stood for us, we stand for him." Local pastors organized a vigil, students from the county high school staged a walkout, and for the first time in Lindell Creek's modern history, protests were forming, not out of anger alone, but with direction. Shaq stayed off the screen. No tweets, no interviews, but his silence was not absence. It was strategy. He spent the day making calls, forwarding Lenora's letter and Jasper's records to civil rights attorneys, confirming that every thread from the case was anchored with documentation. He knew the power of the public eye, but he also knew its attention span was fragile. He wasn't chasing momentum, he was setting foundations. That night, Shaq stood at the back of the vigil in the same clothes he'd worn to the funeral. The crowd was larger than expected. Candles flickered against the wind. Rochelle stood beside him, holding his elbow with quiet reverence. A young boy approached Shaq with wide eyes and asked, "Did you protect him?" Shaq looked down, considered the question, then answered, "I was just where I needed to be." And the camera caught that too, the kind that doesn't blink. By the time the crowd began to thin, the mayor had released a statement calling the incident deeply unfortunate and promising a review. But no one was listening to her anymore. The truth had already moved ahead of politics. The protests weren't just reaction, they were revelation. Generational silence had been broken, not with a scream, but with a tap of a finger on a record button. One shaky video had done what years of reports couldn't. It exposed not just a moment, but a pattern. And that night, as news anchors rehearsed their scripts and headlines refreshed by the second, one quiet fact settled across the town. The camera had not blinked, and now, neither would the people. Dusk in Lindell Creek usually meant quiet porches, slow ceiling fans, and conversations softened by humidity. But on this particular evening, the temperature felt different, tense, anticipatory. The sun hadn't quite set when the first unmarked sedans rolled into town, dark-tinted windows and plain tags moving with the kind of calm that made people look twice. The agents from Internal Affairs weren't wearing suits or speaking into earpieces. They came dressed like anyone else. Button-downs, denim, flat-toned expressions that gave away nothing, but those who paid attention saw it. The briefcases, the discreet lapel pins, and the way they walked, not aimlessly, but towards something already mapped out. At the Lindell Creek Police Department,
The front doors hadn't even locked for the evening shift change when the first two agents walked in. No announcement, no briefing. They bypassed the reception and requested direct access to Supervisor Harlan Dowse. And when he appeared from his office, blinking under the fluorescent lights, they showed badges, not to intimidate, but to declare that the town's internal shielding had come to an end. Dowse tried to maintain composure. He had watched the video earlier, eyes flickering with discomfort, but not surprise. He knew Trenton was a liability, but he hadn't expected the reaction to hit this hard, this fast. He certainly hadn't expected Shaq O'Neal to be part of it. When the agents mentioned the advisory board, he understood instantly. This wasn't local. It wasn't even just state. This was systemic. Trenton was pulled from the field within the hour. No cuffs, no outbursts. Just a quiet walk into the back interview room, where the weight of his father's name no longer protected him. His eyes darted once to the officers still lingering near their desks, waiting to see how deep the knife would go. They didn't have to wait long. By the time night fully set in, 3 additional suspensions had been handed down. 2 patrolmen and 1 desk sergeant, all with prior complaints that had been internally dismissed under Dowse's supervision. The agents moved with precision, not just looking at Trenton, but at the machine around him, the paperwork, the approvals, the timelines. Patterns were forming like fingerprints under heat. At the station, whispers turned into tension. Nobody yelled, but no one could ignore the shift. The desks that had once represented untouchable routine were now battlegrounds of accountability. Files were seized, backup drives copied, and Dowse himself, the man who once claimed procedural clarity as his shield, found his name under review for misconduct in oversight. Outside, the streets were quieter than the chaos might suggest. There were no riots, no broken windows, just groups of neighbors watching from porches, knowing something rare was happening. The system had turned its gaze inward. Shaq, aware of every movement, didn't hover near the station. He remained at the chapel grounds, meeting quietly with a pair of legal consultants from Atlanta, who had arrived at his request. They weren't television lawyers. They were civil rights specialists, veterans of cases where memory met statute, and truth became policy. They reviewed Lenora's letter, Jasper's files, Rochelle's video. The pieces were falling into place with legal clarity. Back at the station, a younger officer named Julian Gant sat at his desk, watching it all unfold. He joined the department 2 years ago, with idealism still intact. Tonight, that idealism was replaced by quiet resolve. He opened a folder from his bottom drawer, a complaint he'd filed months earlier, about misconduct in a traffic stop, led by one of the suspended officers. It had been ignored. Now, he slid Archix the desk to an IA agent, without a word. The storm had begun not with fire, but with procedure, meticulous, slow-burning justice wrapped in bureaucracy. And yet it was no less powerful. As the agents continued interviews, as drives were logged and records reviewed, the funeral day drew to a close. But no one felt closure. They felt awakening. At a small cafe near City Square, the TVs had shifted from entertainment to live coverage. CNN anchors now referenced Lindell Creek with urgency, speculating on institutional rot and calling for broader review. The mayor issued a formal statement promising full cooperation, but no one mistook it for leadership. She was reacting. The leadership had come from somewhere else, from someone who didn't wear a badge but commanded attention without needing one. As Shaq left the chapel for the first time since morning, he passed Elijah's hospital room address to the legal team. He would visit him tomorrow, but tonight he had one more call to make. Not to the press, not to Annette, but to a quiet ally in Washington, someone who had been waiting for the right case to push into federal review. Trenton's reign had ended, but what had started was far bigger. The storm wasn't just legal. It was generational accountability with a name, and Lindell Creek was no longer in control of its own silence. The morning after the funeral broke over Lindell Creek like a slow, reluctant confession. Fog clung low to the streets, masking the town in a kind of hesitant quiet. The police station stood still under the pale dawn light, its brick walls unchanged, though everything inside them had shifted. Wade Trenton arrived just after 7, like always. Same uniform, same stride. His name still on the schedule, but the air around him felt thinner, less certain. The security panel at the station door beeped him in. No red light yet. The badge still worked. The illusion still held, just barely. Inside, the bullpen was quieter than usual. Conversations were clipped, glances short. A few officers looked up from desks and quickly looked back down. The morning radio chatter played low in the background, hollow and directionless. There was no coffee brewing, no banter, only the sound of steps on linoleum. Trenton made his way toward the locker room, running on routine, pretending the previous 24 hours hadn't detonated his reputation. He still carried the weight of his badge like it was armor, but it had become glass-thin, brittle, and already cracked. He didn't look left or right, just focused on the time clock. One more day, he told himself. Get through it. But when he pushed through the locker room door, he stopped cold. A man stood waiting inside, not in uniform, not familiar, but official in a way that couldn't be mistaken. The suit was dark. The expression was darker, and clipped to the belt was a Department of Justice badge, federal, unmistakable, and pointed like a gavel. The agent didn't posture. He just held out a single envelope and said the words like a verdict. You won't need to clock in today. Trenton didn't speak. He didn't ask what the envelope held. He knew it wasn't just a suspension letter. It was notification of a pending federal investigation into civil rights violations, an escalation that moved beyond state borders, past oversight, past politics. The envelope felt heavier than paper. He didn't tear it open. He just nodded once, the tiniest movement betraying what little composure he had left. As he turned to walk out, the badge on his chest suddenly felt like it weighed nothing at all. Outside the station, Shaq was waiting, not in a show of triumph, not in protest, just presence. He stood beside his SUV, arms at his side, face unreadable. No crowd, no news vans, just him, bearing witness as a town finally confronted itself. Trenton stepped out and froze. Their eyes met across the parking lot, one man stripped of power, the other holding none, yet commanding everything. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. His expression was calm, almost mournful, as if watching not a man, but a system finally collapse under the weight of its own design. Trenton hesitated. For a moment he looked like he might speak, but there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been exposed. The silence between them wasn't tense. It was conclusive. Shaq's gaze lingered as Trenton walked toward his vehicle, each step slower than the last. No reporters followed. No cameras captured it. Just the town's cold morning air, and the echo of authority draining from its source. From across the street, behind the tinted windows of a bakery's front window, people watched. They didn't cheer, they didn't jeer, they observed. The moment didn't call for celebration. It demanded reflection. Inside the police station, the federal agent began interviews, not with aggression, with documentation. Officers were called in one by one, asked to recount procedures, past calls, overlooked complaints. The machinery that had protected men like Trenton was being dissected piece by piece, the final shift no longer his, but the department. Shaq turned back to his SUV slowly, pausing only once to glance at the town square. It looked unchanged, same bench, same rusted lampposts. But something had moved beneath it all. A weight had lifted, not justice fulfilled, not yet, but truth acknowledged, and that was something. Later that day, Elijah would begin physical therapy. The hospital cleared him to walk assisted. Layla remained at his side, holding the same folded flag, now housed in a new frame, gifted by the community. And at City Hall, a motion was filed quietly, an emergency council session to review the hiring protocol for law enforcement officers and re-examine use of force guidelines. It wouldn't fix everything, but it would change something. The funeral day had ended, but its echoes still rang across every sidewalk, courtroom, and kitchen table. In the end, Trenton didn't slam a door. He didn't protest his innocence. He simply drove away. And in the rearview mirror, Lindell Creek didn't wave goodbye. It watched, finally, without flinching. Weeks passed, and Lindell Creek no longer moved on autopilot. The air was different, not because justice had arrived wearing armor, but because silence had been pierced, not shattered, just opened wide enough for memory to breathe. The chapel's garden bloomed early that spring. The groundskeepers said it was the softest the soil had felt in years. Shaq visited once more, not with a crowd, not for ceremony, but with quiet. He stood near the small plaque that had been placed at the edge of the lawn, in honor of Jasper Marin, a man of quiet strength. Layla had picked the wording herself. Inside Town Hall, framed behind glass now, was the first draft of a new policy, the Elijah Amendment, A civilian-introduced reform redefining use of force thresholds during civilian mourning events and religious observances. It wasn't a sweeping legislative overhaul, but it was a first not just in Lindell Creek, but in the entire state. The line between power and people had been redrawn, and this time it was signed by both. Elijah recovered slowly. Physical therapy took time, but he moved with patience. What hurt more than the taser was the betrayal it symbolized. Yet, with each session his posture straightened again, not just from strength but from clarity. He had become the embodiment of what the community had refused to lose: dignity. Layla remained his shadow, or maybe his light. She held on to that flag still, now displayed in a glass frame resting on their living room mantel. She would visit the new community center named after her father every week, sometimes reading aloud the letters he wrote during his service. Sometimes she did it alone. Sometimes neighbors joined. As for Officer Trenton, he faded, not in public disgrace, but in something far more permanent: historical dismissal. The case against him moved slowly, tied up in federal procedure and endless internal memos, but the outcome was already sealed. He would never wear a badge again. His name became shorthand in activist circles, not just for misconduct, but for the quiet networks that protected men like him. He wasn't a headline, he was a warning label. And that was enough. Shaq never gave an interview about that day, never wrote a book, never turned the moment into a speech. He refused requests to speak at colleges or civil panels. When asked, he simply said, "That wasn't my story to tell." But people kept talking. Not about what he said. About what he didn't. No microphone. No viral soundbite. Just presence. He visited more towns in the months after. Quietly. Showed up at council meetings as a guest. Sat in the back row. Listened. Not to be a hero. Just to make sure no one forgot how quickly injustice blooms when no one's watching. He called it witness work. In Lindell Creek, his influence lingered long after his SUV disappeared down the highway. A mural was painted near the high school. Elijah's silhouette in uniform, Layla holding a flag, and behind them, the outline of a tall figure standing silently under an oak tree. No name, no caption, just the image. The mural was titled "The Day the Town Listened." In the courthouse records room, clerks began digitizing every complaint ever filed against the LCPD. Shaq had helped fund the software. Privately, when asked why he did it, he responded, "Because sunlight needs space." Back in Atlanta, he hosted small gatherings. No cameras allowed. Lawyers, social workers, counselors, and pastors. People who did the unseen work. He brought them dinner, sat among them, asked about burnout, asked how he could help. Not as a figurehead, but as a teammate. He became something rare, a man who didn't need credit to create impact. At the governor's office, Inez Calhoun reviewed the final closure report. 46 policy revisions triggered across 3 counties. 3 terminations. A pending statewide audit on officer legacy exemptions. And at the very top of the file, a handwritten note from her. Because one man decided not to yell, he stood instead. Shaq never responded to the note. He didn't need to. The work was still ongoing. And yet, the town changed. The bakery reopened under new management. The diner added a framed photo of Jasper above the register. City council meetings began streaming live. Students now studied local history as part of their civics curriculum, which included a chapter titled "The Funeral That Brought Reform." Some changes were subtle. Doors stayed open longer. Officers nodded first. People who had lived decades in the same neighborhood without ever being asked about their stories were suddenly invited to town panels, planning boards, and hiring committees. It didn't fix everything, but it acknowledged something had been broken. Shaq returned only once more that year. He didn't stop at the chapel or the mural. He drove past them all and parked near the old field on Broad Street, the one that used to be a dumping ground before the community turned it into a garden. Now it was a park, and at the gate stood a new sign.
Marin Legacy Park.
Dedicated to those who endured, believed, and stood. He walked the trail slowly, unnoticed by most. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there to see if the soil had taken root. He sat on a bench at the edge of the walking path, closed his eyes and let the wind settle over him. No camera, no echo, just breath and earth and memory. That was how change felt. Not explosive, but persistent. Not loud, but steady. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the pavement, Shaq stood once more. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The giant who didn't shout had already been heard. And history, this time, had listened. This isn't just a story about injustice. It's a memory someone tried to bury, and a town that refused to let it die. If something in you stirred while reading, let it move you where silence used to live. Tell a friend. Start a conversation. Look around your own Lindell Creek. Because sometimes, the quietest witnesses change the loudest systems.